in the next 20 minutes or so, I want to talk about critical race theory, what it means, and the range of perspectives that it represents. But I also want to talk about what it is not, because I think that there is a lot of conversation, as Adrian alluded to in his introduction today. There's a lot of conversation that would portray an idea around talking about race in the 21st century that is not critical race theory, but ironically illustrates some of the core tenets and ideas that critical race theory tries to address. So that's the sort of ground I want to cover today. And my main idea is that if we take critical race theory and take each of those three words, critical and race and theory, that what critical race theory is a theory, like an idea, a set of ideas read together, really, that allow us to understand and interpret the way race as a social construction, as an idea in and of itself, dominates a lot of our conversations, and it really defines the way that we relate to each other as a community, particularly a political community, which is what I'm concerned about as a scholar. And that these conversations get marginalized or left out for political purposes, and not just partisan politics, but the politics of how we understand who's important in society and who is not, right? And so in that sense, critical race theory attempts to broaden the conversation to understand this discourse around power. And by illuminating this discourse around power that takes place within the guise of race, it brings forward ideas that can actually help us move forward as a society. And in that sense, right, critical race theory, I think, is one school of thought among many when it comes to talking about race that can provide worthwhile contributions to help us progress within the American framework, which is what I'm most familiar with. But really, if we think globally, we can think about how race and the law influence us and shape our relationships with each other. It's having that conversation, I think, that critical race theory is about. Now, let me also start by saying that I'm talking to you today from home. And so I'm going to acknowledge that my cat Lulu is roaming around a bit. So if she makes an appearance, let me just apologize in advance. Maybe after the core of my lecture, maybe Lulu can make an appearance, but we'll see what happens. Anyway, so I want to, in sort of describing what critical race theory is, talk about what scholars have said are the key aspects and facets of critical race theory. And I want to lay those out and then offer some comment about what it empowers folks to do in order to see those power relationships in society that I've talked about. And then I want to get into what critical race theory is not. So first, the core ideas. So in a very useful book that I think, if you want to delve into this, I would recommend several books. One that I'm going to note at the beginning is a book by Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik called Critical Race Theory, an Introduction. It's published by NYU Press. It's now in its third edition. So Delgado and Stefanik lay out 5 key ideas, and I want to talk about each of these ideas. The first idea is that racism is ordinary. So the notion of critical race theory begins with the idea, and there are debates, and I should say too, these are my views, and I might borrow from Delgado and Stefanik, and I'll talk about Derek Bell a bit. I'll talk about Kimberly Crenshaw. These are some of the luminaries in the field, but there are lots of people who write about it. And within the field, even though it is a theory in the sense of a collection of key ideas, there may well be disagreement as to the precise nature of some of these ideas and their relevance. But these are the themes, let's say, around critical race theory. One of them is, and let me list all 5 actually, so that we can then come back and talk about each in depth. One is that racism is ordinary. The second is that transformation of issues around race often is dependent on what CRT scholars call interest convergence. The third idea is that race is not a biological reality, that instead it's a social construct. The fourth is that as a social construct, race is used as a tool to form perspectives that are racialized. And in that sense, we perceive the world through racial lenses, right? And in that sense, race as an ideological construct continues to be formed and continues to be perpetuated for purposes of maintaining power. And the fifth idea is the idea of intersectionality, that each of us as people and as individuals or as groups are more than just one characteristic. We are more than just one version of our identity, right? And this idea is that we are actually the intersection of multiple identities. So intersectionality as a fifth theme of critical race theory. So let's go back then, right? First of all, racism is ordinary. The idea that racism is ordinary stands in stark contrast to the way that we think about, or the way that race is often talked about in circles that want to sort of look past the history of race in the United States. The idea here is that racism as a force, as a construct, is a heuristic. And by heuristic, I mean a way of seeing the world. And that heuristic of racism is so embedded in our societal fabric that our patterns and practices that are built on racial ideology almost become invisible. Of course, the challenge here is that knowing the reality of race is a product of living in a racialized identity, right? Someone who is of the majority group, and by this, one of the things that critical race theory grapples with is the notion of the black-white binary, because it was born within the American context. And certainly a lot of American history is about white majorities and Black minorities being in conflict. And so in that sense, I want to acknowledge that I might use some of that language, but at the same time, I may well want to know that there are other racial groups in the United States, and certainly each of those groups experiences racism, using structures of power that are constructed around race in order to allocate the benefits and the burdens of society. There's a definition of racism there. But each group experiences this differently, and each individual experiences it differently. And if you're in the majority group, or I should say more accurately, the group in power, your experience of race is very different than if you are a minoritized person. So in this sense, by having as a key theme that racism is ordinary, that for people of color, of whatever group, there is a lived experience of race that is encountered almost every day. And in fact, in thinking about myself personally, and this is another theme of critical race theory, the honoring of personal narrative and experience in order to elucidate what isn't brought forth in the context of formal analysis or thinking in terms of high theory. I think about myself, and one of the stories I can tell in terms of recently experiencing race is thinking about how when I walk around in Milwaukee, I'm Marquette's in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Milwaukee is a walkable city. I live on the east side of the city, and I often walk around in order to get my exercise in particular. And yet, one of the things that I have chosen to do in Milwaukee is to wait until sunrise in order to walk. And I do that because as a law professor, as someone who looks at civil rights, as someone where I live is only a block away from a very high profile police encounter with a member of the Milwaukee Bucks basketball team, and which led to a major civil rights lawsuit. Being aware of all those things makes me want to not be outside where I could get pulled over by the cops on a pretextual reason and thus be put at risk. And in a sense, that's my experience of race as a Black man in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, aware of the bad police record that the Milwaukee Police Department has. Now, oftentimes I talk about this stuff when I teach my critical race theory class, and my students hear that, and the majority white students in that class go, well, I've never had that experience. And that's just a straightforward way of saying that what is ordinary in my life may well be invisible to their lives. And as being part of the majority, they get the advantage of what's often talked about as colorblindness, right? The idea of colorblindness is the idea that we can treat society as having an absence of consideration of race, and that by having rules around what to do regarding thinking that deals in race, that we, in essence, have solved the problem of racism, or that at least neutrality towards race addresses racial concerns. So to take my example of the experience of walking the streets in Milwaukee, if one doesn't have the benefit of being in the racial majority, then one can be blind to those concerns. Like my students who were a bit taken back that a law professor who's wealthy and middle-aged and has a position of influence, worries about my situation as a man of African descent in relation to the police, right? And yet part of this, again, it's about power and relationships that are dictated by race. And part of that is the shock that comes from saying, oh, yes, you're a powerful man, Professor Ellis, but you realize that there are places where you are not powerful. And that I get read through my racial identity as opposed to some other identity. How I am perceived as in terms of race is far more apparent and immediate than the fact that I have a license as a lawyer in 2 different states, that I have 3 major degrees and all of those credentials that we read about me in the beginning, and the wealth and that might come with that. Now, this leads to another point, that all of my identity, aside from the things that I have chosen to do, all of my identity in terms of how I get perceived in the world is socially constructed. I mentioned one of the points was the social construction of race. Now, this starts from a very important premise, that biologically, there is no such thing as race as a biological distinguishing thing for human beings. In other words, no matter what our skin looks like or where we're from or what label we might be given scientifically, we are all Homo sapiens sapiens, Latin for wise man. We are all of the genus Homidae, all of that specific species. Our phenotypes might vary our skin color as a product of the experiences that come from our ancestry over a couple of 100,000 years. But race is not a biological thing. We are all one human species. So this begs a very important question. Why do we think in terms of race? Well, this is the notion of the social construction of race, that throughout human history, people have talked in terms of race as a way of disaggregating one group of people from another. But our modern conception of race has its origins in the 15th century, when, as a justification for carrying out the slave trade, Europeans constructed notions of race that correlated with our melanin content phenotypes in order to justify enslaving people of African descent as opposed to giving privilege to people of European descent. Now, this is greatly reducing what is a long and complicated history, but this is the origin of the social construction of race, put in a nutshell. And so this notion, this ideology, if you will, this belief that somehow, because I have phenotypes that tend to track with being of African descent versus someone else having a phenotype that tracks with being of European descent, we are somehow inherently different and therefore ought to be treated differently, is the ultimate power dynamic that comes around using an ideology of race, right? As a law professor, I think of it specifically in terms of the idea of using definitions of race and beliefs about race in order to shape the law, in order to give certain people privilege and to deny privileges and benefits to others. And if you look through history, you can see across legal disciplines, right? Whether it be the criminal law or the law of making contracts and agreements to do business, or getting to own property, or being able to vote, right? And or being able to get an education. In all of those places, you can look at the history where racial identification was used as a reason for including some people and excluding others. Let me talk about voting for just a moment, because this is my area of expertise, writing at the intersection of critical theory and the law of democracy. The law of democracy, from the creation of the colonies and the founding of the United States of America up to the Civil War, allowed for states to use racial identity as a reason to exclude people from the ballot box. If you were an enslaved person in chattel slavery in the South in the United States, up until the passage of the 13th Amendment, you were denied all forms of citizenship, including the ability to vote. Even if you were a free person of African descent in the United States in the first half of the 18th century, people could intimidate you from voting, and that was effectively legalized. And indeed, in what is probably the most infamous decision of the United States Supreme Court in its history, Dred Scott v. Sanford, that court case in essence said that Africans in America had, to use that court's language, no rights that a white man need to honor. No rights, no admission to citizenship. So this is just one example of the many of the social construction of race and how it is used to distribute power in society. Now, of course, it's not 1857 anymore, it's 2022. And part of the research that critical race theory does is to lay out how these patterns of power distribution continue to play out 2 centuries later. And of course, Dred Scott v. Sanford was overruled by the 13th Amendment. The Reconstruction Amendments abolished conscious racial categorization, but for the period of Jim Crow, states were still left to be able to discriminate on the basis of race in the guise of laws that were able to target people of color and to put them in the status of second-class citizenship. But of course, that changed from a legal point of view after a century of advocacy. That changed with Brown versus the Board of Education in 1954, where the US Supreme Court said that it was unconstitutional to have a doctrine of separate but equal. And very briefly, the history of separate but equal was the idea that races could be separated if their facilities for separation were equal. So Black kids could go to one school and white kids could go to another school if those schools were treated equally. Now, the reality of separate but equal and segregation was that those schools were not equal, where Black people were segregated to by the state were typically not equal to where white people were segregated to. The state put its resources in the white schools, not the black schools. The Supreme Court in Brown outlawed that. Now, of course, Brown gets read as a heroic opinion where we as a society say that racial segregation was an evil and therefore wrong. And a racial segregation that is about that power allocation is obviously wrong. But the critical race theory account complicates this by saying that the Supreme Court did not reach that conclusion simply because 9 justices woke up one day and these senior white male jurists suddenly had a recognition that equality ought to be the law of the land. One very important account in critical race theory says that there was actually political pressure that made it in the interest of the white establishment that to outlaw segregation, and that it wasn't some vision of equality and justice that in and of itself led to the opinion in Brown. Now, what I'm referring to is Derek Bell's influential paper, Brown versus the Board of Education and the Interest Convergence Dilemma. And you remember one of the points I made was that interest convergence is an important idea in critical race theory. Bell argued that the United States in the 1950s was, on the one hand, a claimant to the mantle of the champion of democracy in the world, right? 1954 was nearly a decade after the United States helped to lead World War II, the war against fascism and Nazi Germany. And from that point, once Nazi Germany was defeated, the Soviet Union and the United States opposed each other in the Cold War. And the United States said to the world, we are champions of democracy, we are champions of capitalism. The Soviet Union is about authoritarianism and communism, and that the United States basically had the moral high ground. But as I suggested, this is still the latter days of Jim Crow in the United States itself. All of that segregation and its evils were still playing out. Indeed, African Americans could not vote. They couldn't in major numbers. At best, the African American political participation rate was somewhere around 25 to 30%. African Americans suffered police violence. They also suffered lynchings that were socially sanctioned. Segregation made all of the state-sanctioned division worse for African Americans. African Americans were second-class citizens. This tension was fodder for the countries that looked at the United States and looked at its claims of moral superiority because it was the champion of democracy. And they said to the United States, you're hypocrites. You are hypocrites because you have racial apartheid at home and you aren't willing to talk about it. Bell posited that this tension between racial apartheid domestically and claiming to be the champion of democracy internationally created a tension that could not be resolved by leaving segregation unaddressed. And that this tension, this political problem that the United States had around the world wasn't the United States problem in and of itself. It was a problem of the white majority of the United States to be deemed a hypocrite. And in that sense, it was in the white establishment's interest to transform segregation So given that story, interest convergence theory is quite easy. White interests in changing the narrative about segregation converged with African American interests in ending racial apartheid. And because the majority and the minority's interests would converge, that interest convergence, Bell argued, led to Brown. And critical race theorists have taken Bell's interest convergence thesis and seen it, or its opposite, or variations of it, as a way of describing power relationships mediated by race. So again, this is an analysis of power. This is an analysis of racism as a way of mediating power. And so in the modern day, we come to the question that is my fourth point, right? The continued perpetuation of racialization as a means of distributing power. Brown basically outlawed explicit racial labels and implicit labels that had bad racial effects. And of course, those who talk about colorblind constitutionalism would say that Brown and ideas like it are the way that America has solved the race problem. But of course, part of the way that critical race theory approaches things is to look not at like the legal precepts or the ideas that might end things around racist effects formally, right? Formal equal opportunity is our modern way of looking at society. And it's the way the law approaches things. But in the spirit of critical theory, right? Bringing up the ideas that don't often get answered. One way of thinking critically about this is looking at the effects of laws, notwithstanding whatever their intention might be, as evidence that racialized inequality continues to perpetuate in society. Now, let me come back to Milwaukee for a minute, right? Milwaukee, at least on some measures, is looked at as the most racially segregated country in the most racially segregated city in the United States. Now, I live on the east side near Lake Michigan, and it's quite beautiful here. But and it's very interesting. If you pull up a map of Milwaukee, you'll see, or if you'll Google Milwaukee and most racially segregated city in the United States, you'll start to see evidence of how the shaping of Milwaukee as a city, the building of, say, interstate highways that demolished Black communities, the building of infrastructure that benefits the downtown area and the east side, but the west side gets left out, the lack of economic development and the high crime rates all feed into a vision of a largely majority white Milwaukee that enjoys the benefits of living in this society that is formally equal, and a Black Milwaukee that suffers high crime rates, high joblessness, and the like. And I could spend a whole other hour talking about these sorts of issues, but what it comes down to is that lack of economic opportunity and long-standing structural segregation that continued despite the pronouncements in Brown lead to this state of affairs in 2022. almost 70 years after segregation was outlawed. Now, looking at that evidence and connecting it to the history in order to see patterns continuing. And to use one example, part of this segregation and seeing that pattern is what critical race theory is out to do. And what comes to mind when I think about the patterns in Milwaukee is the pattern of redlining, right? It doesn't take much to go look up the maps of redlining in Milwaukee and to see that the communities today that are suffering from socioeconomic blight are the communities that were a century ago excluded from governmental benefits. If you're not familiar with redlining was a practice, and actually still ongoing in certain circumstances, even in the 21st century. But redlining is a practice where back in the 1930s and 40s, the federal government, in order to help end the Great Depression and to help GIs returning home from World War II, the federal government gave loans at low interest to help people buy houses. And the federal government walked through the city of Milwaukee and a number of major cities throughout the United States, and they drew maps. And they shaded some parts of the map green and other parts yellow and other parts red. The zones with green got the most beneficial loans. The yellow got less favorable loans. Those parts of the map drawn with a red line got no loans. And of course, from the 1930s and 40s to today, the short version of the story is that the communities that got the money were able to build capital and to build wealth, but the communities that did not were not able to build wealth and now suffer poverty today. And that division is racialized. So looking at that is looking at an example of the continued perpetuation of race through the law today. And even though redlining laws were struck down in the Fair Housing Act of 1968, the practice continues both through not the federal government, but some private banks have been sued in the last decade for distributing mortgages on a red line basis. And of course, the government hasn't addressed the consequences of redlining. So that is a piece of evidence to this notion of looking at the facts in order to see the perpetuation of racism. Now, to my fifth and final point, and then I think we've hit a point where we can start taking some questions. Intersectionality. Now, the notion of intersectionality, as I said at the beginning of the talk, is the idea that no one is just one identity, and that groups of people are treated differently because of their intersection of identities. And just to make this brief, because I want to open this up to questions, there is a great example in terms of race around hairstyle. Now, African-American women have been treated in discriminatory manners concerning their hairstyles. And there are laws being passed now to outlaw that discrimination. It's not just about being Black, but it's about being Black and female and having a particular form of hair, which has been documented as a basis that people have used to say one is unprofessional. Now, it's a short example, but it illustrates that it's not just race. It may be race and class or race and gender, or the mix of the three. But in looking at these problems, we have to look more than just what people say is your one sole identity. Now, I've been talking for a while. Let's open it up to questions.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for your presentation, Dr. Ellis. We really appreciate it. But yes, we do have a few questions. And for those of you that are probably thinking about asking, yes, Dr. Ellis may be complete with his presentation, but as the Q&A goes along, feel free to send those questions to me. We do have some additional time that we can use, so we want to encourage you all to take advantage of that. But for the questions that we do have, we did want to go ahead and get started. So the first one is surrounding the term colorblindness. And the question is, a number of scholars have claimed and argued that the idea of colorblindness really starts to take hold over the US following the Civil Rights era. And that regardless of the civil rights leaders, whether they wanted to agree or disagree with colorblindness, it was becoming a truth for many Americans at that time. Do you think there was a missed opportunity in sort of recorrecting a narrative surrounding race in America? And if so, was this a result of compromise in order to get bills passed through Congress?
Ooh, interesting. So I do think that there was a missed opportunity in terms of transforming the way that we think about race. And in that sense, we have sort of fixed, let me put it this way. I think we incorrectly equate believing as a policy matter in terms of a vision of anti-discrimination, right? In terms of creating formal equal opportunity, and then equating that with ending race, right? And in other words, I'm thinking about Chief Justice John Roberts when he wrote, the way to stop discriminating on the basis of race is to stop discriminating on the basis of race, as if the formal law, and he wrote that in, I think, the parents involved Supreme Court decision around school desegregation in, I want to say 2005 or 2006. To me, that, the ultimate problem here is that is the oversimplification that we function under, right? We equate having formal equal opportunity, right? The laws don't formally discriminate. We equate that with achieving or moving in the right direction towards colorblindness, rather than what if I could intervene in the 60s. Actually, let me put it this way. People latch onto Dr. King's rhetoric. I have a dream. I want my 4 little children to be treated by the content of their character, not the color of their skin, as the sort of moment of there's colorblind beliefs and we can put those in action through the law.
Yeah.
In a sense, that's a first step, but that's a necessary step, but not a sufficient step. And because within a decade, the Supreme Court, in a case called Washington v. Davis, basically said, for purposes of the Constitution, we can't talk about the effects that law have. All we can do is say, was the law passed with a discriminatory intent? If so, then we can talk about whether it's illegal or not. But if the law is neutral on its face, but has disparate racial impact, we can't have a conversation under the Constitution around that. So in a sense, that form of colorblindness that equates formal equal opportunity with achieving equality is our problem point. And I would say that's the missed opportunity. And if we could have a conversation, I think Justice Thurgood Marshall oftentimes talked about, well, we have to be able to talk about racial effects in order to solve racial problems. And I know others have said that, but the fact that that conversation is getting eschewed is part of our problem. And in a way, I'm going to answer two questions for the value of one. That is the heart of the problem with the anti-CRT movement that we see today. Equating any conversation about disparate racial effects as this critical race theory thing, and then equating it to scaring school children and saying it must be morally offensive, right? That is an ideological game in and of itself that points to another form of the social construction of racism.
Yeah, thank you for that. So we do have a couple of questions, and I want to assure everyone that I have been reading through the questions that are here. Some of you all have, in many ways, similar questions, and so I may sort of infuse them together just for the purpose of time. One of the questions that we have here is sort of centered around, and you might have answered this to some degree, but we feel like it may be important to at least ask. You explored a little bit earlier on regarding Brown versus Board of Education and the tension that was building through outside sources on why the US sort of made the decision that it did. The question is, many scholars, lawyers, activists use critical race theory to explain how on some level many public schools are still segregated. In your views, is there any merit on the criticism of Brown versus Board of Education? And if so, can you help us unpack those criticisms?
Right. So it's funny, Bell wrote another article after the interest convergence dilemma piece, where he argued that the civil rights lawyers who were starting with Brown and then going through the desegregation fights of the 60s and 70s were following an agenda that was not rooted in addressing the needs of the African-American communities that they were out to represent. And the reason why I start there is that it kind of gets at the tension that is around Brown and why Brown is problematic. It's one thing to say, well, we want to end segregation, right? That segregation creates a harm, that treating Black communities differently from white communities creates a harm. But in a sense, the remedy that ultimately came in terms of desegregation was to put, as Bell and others might argue, to put Black kids in white schools that had not addressed their white supremacy problem. In other words, putting children of color in majority schools that were not helpful to those children of color. And so in this sense, by framing the remedy for racism as a desegregation that doesn't address the underlying problem of white supremacy, it doesn't actually fix the underlying problem. All we're saying is we can put people together, but not take apart the power dynamics around that social construction of race, and therefore racial harm continues to form and perpetuate. So if we're really fixing white supremacy, then the idea needed to be something far more expansive than what was contained in Brown.
Mm.
And so Bell's critique points to that in as much as it's not just desegregating, but how do we help human flourishing above and beyond just ending formal segregation, right? Particularly for people who live in this history of being minoritized.
Yeah, it's almost when you were to look at maybe the story of Ruby Bridges, which is probably one of the more famous ones, it's not just about placing her in a predominantly white school, but what are the issues that she would face once she's in that predominantly white school? That is perhaps where our concerns need to be focused on.
Right, with Ruby Bridges and so many others, like if you have to go through a mob that would be happy to kill you in order to get to that school, what does that do to you? What trauma does that create for you, right? If you're living in that school and suffering abuse, what does that do to you? You know, and there are some people who argue that from that perspective, that in some ways, segregation wasn't such a bad thing to the extent that communities of color were able to form their own power base and create their own schools and businesses and communities, right? One thing that I didn't highlight, but it's worth saying here, keep in mind that segregation wasn't universally bad for all people of color, right? You know, just look at the Harlem Renaissance, for example. And you know, Black communities in Harlem, New York, able to create cultural and social and monetary and political capital for themselves. And some of the critiques of Brown include the critique that by forcing integration, you've destroyed some of those things. So it's complicated.
Yeah.
But that's where this critique comes from.
Thank you. I did want to jump to another question, and I've seen a few people here that have sort of asked in similar ways. The general premise that I'm seeing for these three in particular is surrounding the Supreme Court and the trajectory that we've seen in light of recent events, in historical ways of how the Supreme Court has, in instances, upheld institutions that have sort of perpetuated racism. Do you have any thoughts or concerns about the role Supreme Court could hypothetically play when it comes to things like public education? And is there any historical precedent that sort of justifies the concerns that people have in regarding the Supreme Court, the negative impacts that it has and could have on things like public education?
So I would start from the premise that the historical pattern from, you know, if we look at pre-Reconstruction, right? So from the founding to the end of the Civil War, you know, these conversations weren't being had because everyone agreed to the political economy, everyone in power, I should say, agreed to the political economy of slavery. But from Reconstruction forward, it seems the pattern has been federal government intervention might lead to passing a law, right? Reconstruction was about the South being held in check by the federal government and the Union Army, and laws were passed for the benefits of formerly enslaved people. But then over time, the Supreme Court passes opinions, hears cases that reduce, if not outright strike down those laws. And for a time, there will be a resurgence, and a different court might say, hey, wait a minute, no, we want to see it a different way. And then as courts come and go, things go back and forth. So I think when it comes to things like public education or political rights, or even all sorts of, basically anything where there's a question of equality, the more conservative, more ideologically conservative the court has been, the more the court has said, this isn't our business, and we don't want to get into these issues, with the effect of folks who want to create laws with effects that discriminate get free rein. But, you know, in fairness to the Warren Court, the court that handed down Brown versus Board of Education, you know, there are some other opinions that are probably worth more than, I mean, we critiqued Brown 1 and 2, but I would actually point to a completely different example. Leaving education to the side, pointing to political rights, Earl Warren said that his most important opinion was an opinion called Reynolds v. Sims. Reynolds v. Sims was about redistricting, right? We draw districts every 10 years based on the census, and those create our political districts where we vote for people, right? So we redistrict Congress. So before Reynolds v. Sims, districts could be wildly disproportionate, which meant that small minorities could have big swaths of power. And Reynolds came out of the South, where small minorities of white folks living in cities had far more power than the Black folks living in the country because of disproportionate districting. Reynolds basically said, no, districts have to be equal in size, not just equal in size, but equal in population. Mm-hmm. So every vote counts the same amount, which gives all of us a better shot at getting political power. And that way, when we're electing the people who make the decisions about the laws, they're equally accountable to each one of us as voters. Now, to me, that kind of intervention changes the structure of everything in a way where the people on the margins get a fair shot at having their vote count. And that then allows folks to elect school boards who can design fairer school districts. That allows legislatures to create laws that pursue anti-discrimination. That allows for fairer rules around taxation and business generation and all the other things, right? To me, Reynolds is the example of changing the system for the better in a way that won't allow for subjective judgments and backsliding. Just to offer an example. And mind you, even then, through that, to get it back to education, by electing judges who then will judge these school districts more equitably, then we get to change those laws. And to me, this is a problem today because all these anti-CRT laws strike me as obvious violations of the First Amendment. So it would take judges who would be able to see that in order to address those laws.
Yeah, this kind of transitions into probably a question that directly relates. Do you have any counsel for educators and teachers, specifically in the K through 12 area, that are looking for ways to accurately teach history when it comes to race, but are in many ways met with the roadblocks that we've seen consistently get passed throughout certain states. Where do they begin in navigating that road? And is education the place that we can still consider as the primary source of sort of changing the way people view things like racism?
Mhm. Saving the hard one for um my first piece of counsel, and it's something I didn't get into, but I think it's important to stress that critical race theory is not an elementary school pedagogy. I mean, had I longer time, or if you want to invite me back for a series, just hint, hint. One of the things that I would talk about is the idea that, and the way I've talked about it for this past hour is law professors and political scientists and other folks having a theoretical conversation in graduate and professional schools, right? That's what CRT is. And we can talk about how to situate that against traditionalist and reformist visions of understanding what history and law and political science and whatnot are about. But that's not the job of elementary school pedagogy, right? But to classify it this way is to distract from the core issue. And to me, my counsel would be double down on the idea that what's being done in elementary and secondary school education is simply informing students of history so that they can be capable citizens in society. And by mislabeling teaching history as teaching CRT is to destroy that effort. You undercut our students' ability to be educated properly. But I think, though, that being properly educated is the beginning of addressing race in society. I think, let's go back to Ruby Bridges, and all of those other folks who had to live through, what it took to integrate schools, right? Recognizing that is the history and that we passed the laws that we've passed because of that history gives us a reason why we need to be aware of what these laws are out to do. We're not out to backslide, right? We want to maintain our belief in equality, and that only comes from knowing where we've come from. I think the other important point is we can't avoid conversations about who we are as a society going forward. That just teaching the history without editing it, without editing all the conversations about race out of it, leaves us woefully unprepared for how our society is changing, right? The history of race in America has largely been Black and white, but of course, Latinx and folks and people of Asian descent and ongoing immigration defines our future. Our kids won't be prepared if we don't know the past and don't give critical skills to lead into the future. So my advice is hold fast to that the heart of the enterprise, that we are preparing our citizens for tomorrow, and that teaching the history as history is not offering a legal theory, and therefore it's not CRT. Now, of course, the real answer to this, on top of those talking points, is at the end of the day, we all have fear. And I think the people who are the opponents of CRT are fearful of all that change that I just alluded to. And another strategy might be having a conversation with folks about their fears, and to realize that diversity in our society is a virtue, and the fear is the thing that endangers us all. You know, and to me, believing in that is where we all want to get when we talk about judging people based on the content of our character.
Yeah, it sounds as though while we are sort of addressing these sort of racial inequities happening, we still have to accept that the people who are concerned are still going to be here. And what we do in including them in that conversation, it sounds as what you're saying is we have to at least consider addressing those fears so that we don't sort of experience the backsliding that we have been sort of teetering on.
Yeah, I think that's right. But let me also be clear that addressing the fear doesn't mean compromising to their position, right? And in some ways, it all starts from telling the truth, right? One of the things I do in my own scholarly work is spend time talking about the effects of disinformation. And in a way, if we think about the anti-CRT campaigns as a disinformation campaign, the strategy to fighting disinformation is finding a common ground where you can have a conversation and then seeking agreement based on that common ground. So, you know, it's not about the tenets of critical race theory, at least at the outset, but the end game is to say, let's talk about the history that is there, rather than editing it for reasons that are more harmful than helpful.
Yeah, we do have a couple of questions left. Two of them are somewhat in a similar boat. What advice would you give to educators that are looking to edify their anti-racist efforts in their education practices? And are there any good faith critiques that you can look to and say, this is where they could have done these things better, even though their intentions were pure? Are there any best practices and strategies that we can provide to educators when they are looking for ways to implement anti-racist practices in their educational settings?
Well, I will admit that this question takes me a little out of my element, but I do think that one of the things that I have been doing as an educator is part of it is kind of building my own competencies around being able to talk with other people who aren't coming from the place that I'm coming from, right? I've done some time around doing trainings in terms of how I teach, realizing that sometimes given the kind of controversial content that I bring to other adults who may well have not had the background that I have, might be provocative, right? And so one of the things I've done is sort of double down on the strategies of how to communicate across such divides. I think too, in terms of addressing anti-racism effort, there has been over the past few years a number of good books out there that have been published in terms of having those sorts of conversations. Ibram X. Kendi's work comes to mind in terms of history and grounding. I also, just thinking a second, I had another name in my head and I just lost it as quick as I thought of it. But actually, I would say there is probably, I'm just thinking a second, I'm sorry. Kendi, and actually this is a good opportunity if I could think of 4 or 5 resources and maybe we could distribute that as a follow-up email.
Yeah, that sort of leads to the final question, which was, they loved your talk and want a list of readings. So we were always going to send a follow-up email, but perhaps you and I could connect in putting together.
Yeah, that would be great.
Compilation of readings for our listeners here. I think they would probably appreciate that.
Because there's lots of great stuff out there being written. I'm sort of overwhelmed with the number of things, both for general audience and for folks who want to delve into critical race theory specifically. Actually, another author who I would endorse, her name is Kiara Bridges. She wrote a book called Critical Race Theory, a Primer, which kind of walks through topics and gives a history of the debates around CRT in relation to those. And I mentioned the Delgado and Stefanik book at the beginning of my lecture. Critical Race Theory, a Primer, or I think they just call it Critical Race Theory, but it's NYU Press. 3rd edition came out a year or 2 ago. But I can give it some more thought.
Yeah.
And we can put together a little bibliography. That would be great.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we want to respect your time and everyone else's time. So we want to, again, say thank you for providing your time, your knowledge, your energy. If we can just show some appreciation for Dr. Ellis, whether it's in the chat, if you can throw some thank yous, you can use emojis. We would really love to show him our TU appreciation. And what we can also do, as we stated earlier, this is being recorded, and so this will be uploaded on our OIIE YouTube page. You will be getting an email letting you know when that is done. And in that email, we'll also be including the list of anti-racist resources, the list of critical race theory resources that you would want to further explore. We also had a few requests for how white teachers can be better at anti-racist pedagogy. So we'll look into keeping that in mind as we do our research to provide you with all of the resources. Thank you all again for being here. Dr. Ellis, it looked like you had one final thought.
My last word.
Yeah, go ahead.
This is something, I'm the chair of our diversity committee here at our law school. The one thing I would tell folks that you just identified, white teachers, it's better to talk about it and feel uncomfortable and maybe stumble a little bit than not talk about it. Because the things I've heard from my students of color is that white teachers who ignore it come off as ignoring it intentionally and being perceived as being discriminatory. The effort is appreciated, even if people of good faith know that no one's perfect. So try.
Yeah.
But we'll provide resources, as Adrian has said.
Yes, but thank you for those final words. We really appreciate that. We're also getting a few thank yous in the chat. So we appreciate you as the viewers for being with us in this time. Thank you all again. We appreciate you all. Good luck on your final exams. Good luck on gradings. And we will see you all soon. Take care, everyone.
Be well.